My name is Natasha Mitchell from ABC Radio National. I host our daily morning program called Life Matters, and welcome indeed to Melbourne Conversations. This is the City of Melbourne's program of free talks on the culture and life of the city, this wonderful city, Melbourne. But this is a city, like every other city in Australia, that has some very deep concerns to confront and to grapple with, and that's in effect what we're here to do tonight. Our event is Being Poor in a Rich City, Voices on Poverty and Social Inequality. It is Anti-Poverty Week this week, right across Australia, and it's well worth checking out the Anti-Poverty Week website. Lots of activities that people are generating to really put poverty on the national agenda, as it should be. This forum has been developed between two fantastic partners. The Sacred Heart Mission here in Melbourne, many of you will know them very well, and also the Big Issue magazine. They are indeed selling here tonight. Please, I think it's the guy in the fluoro vest, or at the back, buy a Big Issue. And also it has been developed with the support of the Future Leaders Initiative, and they support a lot of Melbourne Conversations events. To kick off tonight, I'd like to introduce Dr. Cathy Alexander. Cathy is the CEO of the City of Melbourne. Cathy is a former South Australian, we'll forgive you for that, Telstra Businesswoman of the Year. Before taking her current role, she held CEO positions in major teaching hospitals, in community health services. She's been in this role for a number of years. She is very passionate about community development in all its forms and guises, and she's here to welcome you tonight. Thank you, Cathy.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everybody to Melbourne Conversations. I respectfully acknowledge that we're gathered here on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like also to acknowledge our panellists, who you'll get to see in a little while, and the Sacred Heart Mission, and also the Big Issue, and indeed Anti-Poverty Week. And I buy about 5 big issues a month, and I reckon they're a really good read, so please do the same. And of course, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, poverty and inequality affect all major capital cities, and that's regardless of whether or not you're voted the world's most #1 city, liveability city. What are we? World's most livable city. That's what we are. And as a capital city, Melbourne really is a magnet for people from across Australia, and indeed from across the globe, who really want to seek new opportunities and make a fresh start. But sadly, homelessness and poverty sometimes prevents people from being able to participate in civic life and indeed in employment, etc., equally. During the City of Melbourne street count in June this year, a total of 101 people were counted as sleeping rough on our streets, and that's been pretty similar for the last 5 years. The City of Melbourne has teamed with Housing Choices Australia and the Dudagala Community Health Service to provide services for people who are homeless. And indeed, we work very, very closely with the Salvation Army and other community services on trying to develop better housing options for people who are homeless. Our city is filled with individuals and organisations, thankfully, who are trying to make a difference, and we are very fortunate to have a number of those organisations and agencies here tonight. Many of those organisations and agencies participated in our homelessness survey, which I was very pleased to facilitate earlier this year. The Homelessness Summit was a fabulous opportunity for people to A, learn about what each other are doing, and B, to hear from a range of people indeed including those who are experiencing homelessness, about the difficulties that they face in trying to access what actually sometimes is a bit of a maze of services rather than a joined up set of services. So I think we've got a lot to learn both from our consumers and from each other. But certainly the Homelessness Summit came up with some fabulous ideas which will form the basis of our plan and information that we will be putting to our new council once it's elected on the 27th of October for next year's plan. And I do hope that we can build on those initiatives and take some further steps forward and help be a part of the solution. So I'm very interested to hear today's proceedings, and thank you very much for attending, and welcome once again to Melbourne Conversations. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Alexander. Yesterday, the Australian Council of Social Service, or ACOS, released some staggering data. I wonder if you caught it in the news. Perhaps you are living the news. 1 in 8 of us in Australia live below the poverty line. 1 in 8 of us. And that is considered to be an underestimate by all those who work in the sector. The other piece of data, amongst many items of data that they've collated together for the first time in some years now, I think it's the first time in 6 years, was that 1 in 6 children in Australia live below the poverty line. And that's probably an underestimate too. 1 in 6? Can you imagine it? And that's by one measure of poverty. The numbers are even more dramatic if you look at another accepted measure of poverty. But data is important because at least it gives us a sense of what's going on. And it begs belief, doesn't it, that in one of the richest, most privileged countries in the world, in one of the most livable cities of the world, we are seeing figures like that. And of course, behind every statistic is a human being with a name and a sense of self, trying to make sense of their life every waking moment of their day. 1 in 8, it seems to me, is an awful lot of Australians with a shared lived experience of financial marginalisation. But also, I think what's important is that it's a significant shared voice which shouldn't be marginalised. Imagine if all of those people took to the stage today and shared some of their experience. We do hope to do that. We do have roving mites, and we'll come to a more open discussion with the audience, with you here tonight. But what we're going to do is first hear from 4 speakers, excellent speakers who have a lot of experience with this particular issue. And just to let you know that we are recording the event for ABC Radio National, and we are also recording it for the City of Melbourne for their YouTube channel. Our first speaker this afternoon or this evening is Penny Wilson, who is recently appointed CEO of VCOS, that's the Victorian Council of Social Service. Penny was formerly CEO of the Responsible Gambling Advocacy Centre. Of course, that's a relevant topic for today's discussion as well, isn't it? She also held the senior roles of Deputy Director and Acting Executive Director of Strategic Communications for the Victorian Department of Innovation, Industry and Regional Development. So she brings a sort of wealth of different experience to this issue. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you to Melbourne Conversations for the invitation, to Cathy Alexander, CEO, and to my fellow panellists, Sheree, Gerry and Chris. I'd really like to thank The Big Issue, and again, there's a seller up the back, and it's a really good issue this week looking at missing people. And of course, the issue that we're talking about is poverty, and this is Anti-Poverty Week. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're standing on Aboriginal land and pay my personal respects to elders past and present of Indigenous peoples and other peoples here. I welcome the opportunity to talk about poverty and Anti-Poverty Week, but it is actually a conversation that we need to have more often. We need to think about the causes, not just the consequences of disadvantage. It's really important that we listen to the voices and hear the stories of people who have experienced the reality of living in poverty. And there's many people here today, and I hope you will take up that offer to share a microphone and let us hear your voice. I wanted to talk about the general picture of disadvantage in Melbourne and look at what communities are experiencing. And I wanted to think about what makes our communities stronger and more resilient, and what we can do to ensure that people get the support they need when they need it. At VCOS, we think the measure of a civil society is how it treats its most disadvantaged citizens, and there are not many more disadvantaged than people living below the poverty line. And those stats that Natasha mentioned, 600,000 children that we know about living below the poverty line. And the Victorian Council of Social Service is a peak body, and our members deliver services to people, or they look at issues affecting the community. We actually have to identify poverty and look to address poverty, and then we have to help those organisations working in the sector. I'm glad that Cathy mentioned the world's most livable city moniker. I always think that that's a really interesting concept, measuring livability. It is truly a great place to live if you can afford it, but as Cathy noted, it can be very difficult for some. It's worth noting that these measurements of livability are developed really for an international business audience and may not have a lot of bearing on the daily lives of people going about their business. So they don't really consider questions of poverty and disadvantage. In reality, we see something slightly different, a city that offers one of the highest standards of living in the world, in a city in which there are around 400,000 people, and many of whom are living in poverty, and where on any given night up to 20,000 people are homeless. We did see the release of the ACOS report on poverty yesterday that showed that 1 in 8 people are living below the poverty line. And this was calculated using quite a complex formula using median incomes. But it's about 358 for a single person, or 752 for a family, or just over $18,000 a year if you're single, or just over $39,000 a year if you're a family. That's not much money by today's standards. It means that almost 12% of the Victorian population are struggling every day to make ends meet. In Melbourne itself, 11.4% of people now live below the poverty line. In regional areas, it's actually higher, and that's another difficult conversation. The figure actually increases by 20% if we look at the 60% people, 60% of median disposable income benchmark. That's people who are living around the poverty line, and it only takes 1 or 2 events for people to slide below. But whatever number you use, we're left with the same conclusions, that there are too many vulnerable people who are at significant risk from poverty. We're very concerned when we hear from our members that more and more people are seeking emergency relief, families that have never had to ask for help before. We know from the figures that 29% of the people in this figure are actually earning a wage in their household. That means they're working but living below the poverty line. We feel we need to know a lot more about the working poor. We need to make sure that being poor or experiencing poverty or crisis events is not stigmatised, that people will ask for help, that they will get help assisting them to plan for future events. What's especially disturbing is the number of already vulnerable people who are living in poverty. That includes the elderly, people with disabilities, and many people who are already on welfare, including those children. In Victoria, 19% of people experiencing homelessness are aged between 12 and 18. 14% are children under 12 years. Today we saw in one of the papers in Melbourne more figures revealing that there's been 117,000 reports of harm to children. We know that that's not just about poverty, but it's certainly a major stressor in families' lives, and it's a risk factor. The growing diversity of people accessing emergency relief means our members are increasingly under pressure. They're facing the same challenges in their funding and their staff. Why is it all happening? We know that Melbourne is growing at an extremely fast pace. I think Cathy can correct me, that we have a population of around 4 million and they're expecting 5 million by 2030. As of the 2011 census, 5 of the 10 fastest growing municipalities in Australia were in the bounds of Greater Melbourne, so driving distance of the city centre. Many of these areas are where we see the greatest growth in the need for crisis community support, such as emergency relief, housing support, crisis financial counselling and family support services. But the services aren't in place. We know that our members in these areas are turning people away because they don't have the resources to help those who are seeking support. We need to think how we plan our communities. But we also need to make sure that we don't ignore the long-standing communities in Melbourne and on Melbourne's fringe. People come here because there are access to services, there is access to public transport. We see that that doesn't always exist in regions outside Melbourne. We need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to become part of this thriving community. We need to make sure that when people come to the city, they can live decently, that they can access food and accommodation, and that they don't have to choose between food or accommodation. That's just not a choice that people should be making. So some of the things I'd like to hear talked about tonight are the questions we should be asking. What are the right questions? If we are to address some of these factors, what does that success look like? Is it the amount of disadvantaged children finishing school, for instance? Education is a key to this question. Is it less people on the street? Is it more flexible accommodation options where a range of needs can be catered for? We ask ourselves at VCOS, what kind of community do we want to live in? We know that stats in young people are particularly concerning. 1 in every 2 young people who were in custody in 2010 in Victoria were the victims of abuse, trauma or neglect prior to incarceration. The demand for out-of-home care for children and young people continues to rise at unprecedented levels. Their outcomes continue to be poorer than those of the general child population. They are overrepresented in youth justice, have poorer health and are less likely to study or work. Early intervention services for children and families have been shown to increase school performance, decrease the need for income support, reduce crime, reduce child protection notifications and decrease health spending. We would extrapolate that they also decrease homelessness and poverty in the City of Melbourne. We encourage you all to think about this and to think about what kind of community do we want to live in? How do we want to make sure that everyone has the chance to participate in the Melbourne City? What we'd like to see is a reduction in the people living in poverty. What we'd like to see is more research into the systemic causes of disadvantage in Victoria. What are the long-term factors contributing to this? We share my fellow panellists' concerns, thinking that this is actually not the true picture. It's a great set of data to start thinking about the issues of homelessness and poverty, but what we need to know is more. Why are there people working who are below the poverty line? Why do people have to make choices between food and accommodation, or accommodation and the basic necessities of life like clothing? It's very hard to hold down a job, as someone reminded me before, if you don't have anywhere to live and you have to go outside your doors to a van to get food. So I hope we continue to discuss this tonight, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Penny Wilson from the Victorian Council of Social Service. I mean, it illustrates, doesn't it, that this is a convergence of so many issues that are alive in the public debate in Australia at the moment, public conversation in Australia at the moment about the future of education, the future of housing prices in Australia. All these issues affect all of us, regardless of whether we feel that we live in poverty or not. And I guess the thing about statistics is that they bind us all. We are all a statistic in one way or another. I'd like to now introduce Sheree Daly. Sheree is the founding member of a choir that you will know very well from that ABC TV documentary about it. It was called the Choir of Hard Knocks. It's now called the Choir of Hope and Inspiration, for very good reason. Sheree is a founding member of that choir. As with her fellow choir members, Sheree knows homelessness and disadvantage firsthand. She's living it every day, right now, I would say, as you'll hear. She also knows about the impact of abusive relationships, of being a mother on low income, and she also knows how a choir like this one can refocus people through connection and care for each other. In fact, she's just back from a tour in Uganda where I gather 40 singers and Jonathan Welch, the founder of that choir, the artistic director of the choir, met with local kids, sung with the African Children's Choir and did much else. So please give Sheree a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Well, I didn't have a good start in life. I grew up in an abusive family environment, which led to me being homeless at the age of 14, 15, because I thought it was the safest point in life, to get away from all that. I kind of didn't finish school, well, sort of. I went to a community school which was hands-on, which was much better because teachers we got to call them first name basis. We didn't get the, you had to do this, you had to do that. They let people do their own pace, and I excelled in that. But through living on the life on the streets at the age of 14, 15, I had nowhere else to turn to but the people on the streets, where I hit the drugs, fell into abusive relationships, you name it. Fell pregnant at an early age through a partner that raped me, and the life story goes on. But through that, I thought, enough, what can I do? So I attended church for about 5 months, and then I had a sign was to move. So 5 months later on, I moved to Melbourne, where I thought life would be better. I didn't know nothing about Melbourne. I was just coming. And I started my life here a very long time ago, but I'll never regret it because it gave me a different point of view. Because back in Adelaide, South Australia, where I'm originally from, it's just like a big country town. There's nothing going there for you, and you just go around in circles and circles. And a lot of people I know, they actually die of drugs or suicide, and the story goes on. So from there, I began my crazy life in Melbourne. Getting my life back on track. I gave up the drugs virtually as soon as I left Adelaide, because people used to say, you can't do it. I'm like, yeah, I can. No one can't tell me I can't, because I was very determined. I didn't really listen to people when they say you can't. From there, I didn't know about accommodation, so I lived on the streets, joined the salvos, did some stuff there with them. They sort of were trying to help me, but because I was still angry and I hated the world, as I'd put it, I just, because I didn't have people that cared or loved, so a trust thing was very much a thing to get through, especially coming from a broken home and stuff like that. So I learnt I had to trust people on the streets because they were my community, they were my people. They were going through the same things as I went through. They were either drug addicts, alcoholics, gamblers. They went through sexual abuse, rape, you name it. So we all connected and we all looked after one another as family. But through living in a rooming house, the salvos sort of helped me get into. It was something I didn't want long term, because in rooming houses there's a lot of drugs and stuff that goes on, and that's not part of my life. I wanted something a bit better for myself and to stand up for the rights of other people, because a lot of people aren't doing drugs, but they're put in that situation where a lot of people go back, So when they have enough of that situation, they go to the streets because it's the safest point, because they want to escape. There could be someone robbing their room, or, people coming in and stabbing one another, or, it's a violent situation. So then BP and Salvation Army came and did a program. You move into private rental, which they organise, which is a house of their own. You go and work for BP for 12 months, because that's a program. And from there, you're meant to get your life on track. I did my 18 months. I worked for BP. I left because of situations of bullying, the pressure of you had to push money on customers, which wasn't my idea of working. I rather interact and make your customers laugh and come back, and enjoy the experience. So after 18 months, I left there, hit the streets again for about 5 months. Then I got offered a role as a lead tenant, which was running a house with 2 other youth, which they go and work for BP. But the I got discriminated because I was a female after 3 months running a male or young youth male situation, because BP were scared that I would sue them if something happened to me. They didn't put their trust in me, knowing I could deal with boys like this because, you know, no matter how hard their life was, I was a role model for them to be able to achieve their 12 months and hopefully get their life back on track. From there, I am currently back on the streets. I live in my car. I have 2 American pup staffs, which keep me going. They keep me focused. The love and the loyalty I get from them and they get from me. It's a responsibility, because if you go to apply for housing, private, it costs too much, or you're not the right nationality, because today it doesn't matter how many accommodations or private rental, they judge you on who you are or where you've come from. And same with jobs. If you're not the right nationality or culture, and this is where the problem lays, because people suspect you to be something you're not. Or, you know, I heard a story before I went over to Africa. No, sorry, we can't hire you because you're not that nationality, like Indian, Asian fellows. How does these people make them feel? Why do they want to get a job? It's because they're being judged. People aren't willing to give them a go. Another reason, the public sector, it can be years before someone gets housing. Most people don't want to go back into a rooming house because of circumstances. So how do we change that? You know, because my theory is I do not want to go back into another rooming house where it's full of drugs and stuff like that, because I know I'm better than that. As much as people say, well, you know, you've got no other choice. But unfortunately I have, and I will make that stand. It's not just for me, it's about other people, you know, because I want to make a way. I may have had a bad start to life, but you know, it doesn't matter what my background is, it's what the future can hold for me. And I do eventually want to get a job, but it's something I want to have passion in. My passion was to go to Africa a long time ago. People go, you know, who paid for you? No one paid for me. I'd saved up my money to actually go to Africa so I can go and do volunteer work and go and see what life was on the other side of the world. We're pretty lucky, well, we should be, through our accommodation, through food. You know, I have to go to food vans to go and get food because I don't have a kitchen and stuff like that. Over in Africa, Uganda, you know, their belief, all they got over there is their belief in God. Their poverty, they've got no showers, they've got no housing, they've got all these kids that play in the dirt, you know, and it's like, will we end up like that, you know, where we have nothing? But I hope, you know, through all this, people can make a difference and make a change and give someone an opportunity. You know, I may look like a hobo at times, but that's okay because I'm me. I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm just here to be myself and make all the right choices.
Sheree said to me that she'd speak from the heart with absolutely no notes, and I was in awe of her. And so there you are. And I'd love to hear more about how the choir has impacted on your life too, so perhaps we can open that out as part of the discussion, and perhaps you might have questions to that effect too. Thank you, Sheree Daly. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Gerry Naughtin. Gerry is co-chair of Anti-Poverty Week Victoria, and he is also CEO of what's called Mind Australia, the country's largest mental health non-government organisation. Gerry's worn many hats. He's been a business owner, an associate professor, a government consultant, a PhD student at the Uni of Melbourne. He's always, though, had an interest in social work, and initially did a Bachelor of Arts with honours in sociology at Monash, before taking on management roles in aged care and disability and the disability sectors. So again, many hats informing the work that he does. And mental health, well, it's at the heart of this whole conversation about poverty, isn't it? Welcome, Gerry.
Thanks, Natasha, and good evening, everyone. As our first two speakers have highlighted so well, being poor in a rich city is a complex and multi-causal reality. Tonight, I want to highlight 4 narratives, or what might be better characterised as themes of the conversations that I hear about poverty in metropolitan and rural Victoria as I travel around this state. We all have different perspectives or narratives on this issue, and I think it's great we have this opportunity, and it's so fantastic that so many of you will be able to come to share in some of these conversations about poverty and what it means in Victoria. As co-chair of Anti-Poverty Week Victoria, and through my involvement in the planning of this week, I've had the opportunity to hear many of the conversations and narratives of the many people involved in Anti-Poverty Week across this state. The first narrative I want to highlight is the level of community concern about and interest in trying to find solutions to poverty. This is a week in which tens of thousands of Victorians are involved in a diverse range of activities about poverty in their communities, in their school, in their community and their workplace. People from all parts and levels of Victorian society are involved in this week. And some of those activities include the Governor holding a morning tea function on Friday, recognising volunteers who are giving out emergency relief and food, schools who are highlighting poverty through special events, lunches, speakers and classroom presentations on poverty. Workplaces where people are having morning teas and raising money to support organisations working for a fairer society. I'm pleased to tell you that the Premier, the Deputy Premier and Mary Wooldridge, the Minister for Community Services, Mental Health and Women's Affairs, are tomorrow morning doing what we're calling plating, Polly's plating for Anti-Poverty Week at St Mary's House of Welcome. A great sign that the leaders in this state are equally concerned about this issue. These diverse activities across the state illustrate that many comfortably off Victorians recognise the reality of poverty and want to do something to highlight both the problem and to think about what are the solutions to this problem. I note an element of uncertainty in the narratives about how do we realistically tackle a problem that appears, based on the evidence from ACOS that was released yesterday and which Penny has spoken about, to be getting worse rather than better in spite of decades of talk about this issue. The second theme I wanted to suggest to you tonight that has a strong presence in Victorian conversations on poverty is that of vulnerability to poverty. The global financial situation and the continual announcements of job redundancies, particularly the manufacturing sector in Victoria, has produced a nervousness and fear amongst some Victorians. I often hear in some of those conversations, might my job be next? This sense of insecurity amongst many people who have historically seen themselves as long-term employed is, I think, an important second conversational narrative in Victoria. The narrative is one of, I might be soon in the poor category through nothing that I have done, but due to global economic market conditions. This, again, is a narrative of uncertainty and insecurity and helplessness against forces much bigger than the person, their skills and the work ethic. I'd suggest this conversation is in a sense, shifting the debate from poverty as a concept of what when I was a young social worker, was talk about the deserving poor, to poverty as a much broader community concept, that there's something that may affect us or our children. So I think that's, in a sense, I'd suggest there is an opening up of the narrative around poverty to be far more community inclusive, rather than seeing poverty as that marginal 12%. It's much more a broader conversation about all of us. This threat of redundancy and unemployment is one that is increasing people's anxiety and depression. Through the work of Mind, our staff are meeting more and more clients whose mental health is being negatively impacted by their actual experience of living below the poverty line, or the potential of being forced to live below the poverty line. The evidence of the connection between low income and poor mental health has been well established, and is, I think, an issue that Natasha was also highlighting. The flip side of this narrative, I'd like to suggest, is the focus on what I would call poverty prevention. This is most commonly expressed as study hard so you can get a job. This narrative can be discerned in many parents, teachers' exhortation to their students, children or young adults, which is really highlighting again this importance of poverty, of education as a strategy for preventing poverty. The third theme that I wanted to highlight tonight is that in my conversations and in the planning of Anti-Poverty Week, I am struck by the lack of involvement of poor people in the activities of the week and the campaigning about anti-poverty. And it was fantastic to have Sheree talking to us tonight with such passion and vigour about her own experience of poverty. So thank you for that, Gerry. The voices that I hear, the conversations I hear, are those of welfare lobbies, service providers, schools, union, health agencies, emergency relief agencies and governments. When you stop and think about it, 12% of the Victorian population is a substantial number of voters, yet poverty alleviation strategies don't seem to be a strong part of the political discussions at election time. I think it is important to ask the question, why is the voice of Victorians living below the poverty line not strong in the narratives or the conversations about being poor in a rich city? In my training years, I did some work with the Brotherhood of St Lawrence and a project there called the Family Centre Project. And part of the idea of that project is, how do we engage people living on the poverty line in addressing their own circumstances, and how do we support them to move out of poverty? I think the issue of the engagement of people, or perhaps the issue of why people living below the poverty line are not able to be engaged in some of these broader debates, is a very important question that we need to pose. My fourth and final theme is the very strong, in terms of narrative, is that is very strong in government thinking and statements, and in many discussions, is the narrative that I want to characterise as keep them poor to provide an incentive for getting a job. This narrative, you would have heard in the papers, in the media in the last few weeks, is used as a justification for not increasing the New Start allowance, for moving single parents off parenting benefits and on to New Start. This narrative suggests that older people and people with a disability deserve to have a higher level of income than the long-term unemployed because either of their age or their impairment. It reflects, I'd suggest, the adoption of American thinking about reducing welfare dependency, but making it pretty unpleasant to live on social security payments. I consider that this narrative is one that needs much more public discussion and critical debate. I note that the ACOS argument that more can and should be done to support people back into employment through education, training and job support. I strongly support the need for more effectively targeted job placement programs. At Mind, we work with many people with mental illness who want to work, but the job preparation, and in particular the job support programs, do not work for them. Education and employment is a critical pathway out of poverty, and more targeted and effective approaches to support people in both developing their education and finding a job are critical. This approach or narrative means that a significant number of Victorian children live in households below the poverty line, and that many people are forced to live without basic necessities. Because of this use of enforced poverty to incentivise, which is the argument that's used, people to look for work. My personal view is that we need to rethink this strategy and find a better balance between a hand out and a hand up. The voices of VCOS and ACOS on this matter are very important parts of the conversations during Anti-Poverty Week. In finishing, I want to acknowledge that reducing poverty in Victoria is a demanding and medium-term task. I, like the other speakers, have been alarmed that the ACOS reports released on Sunday suggest that we are going backwards, not forwards. I think the conversations such as this one about reducing poverty are incredibly important, and congratulate and thank the Melbourne Conversations program and Jeff Taylor, the program manager, for the initiative in organising tonight's conversation. Thank you.
Gerry Naughtin, who is co-chair of Anti-Poverty Week in Victoria, and sometimes I wonder whether we're at risk of sanitising a word like poverty. It's a bit like the word sustainability or innovation, you know, those words that kind of mean so much more than just one word can encapsulate. And I hope tonight we can have hard conversations amongst us after we've heard from our speakers about New Start. Is it enough? How do we keep kids in school when everything at home is chaos? How do we keep them going to school? What about the future of vocational education in Australia? If you didn't manage to finish school, are you going to be able to go back and do a TAFE course that's meaningful, that will get you work, that will lift you out of poverty? What about if you're busy trying to cobble together casual work that will bring in enough money throughout a week? And are they hours that you can juggle and also manage to get your kids to school if you're, say, a single parent? These are the critical issues that we need to bring to bear on this conversation about poverty. I'd like to introduce Chris Middendorp. I think he will be a straight shooter on some of these issues. He is a writer. He is a manager of client support services at Sacred Heart Mission, a fine institution here in Melbourne. As a community worker, Chris has worked in the area of homelessness in Melbourne for over 20 years. He's worked as an outreach worker. He's supporting people sleeping rough. He's coordinated labour market programs. He's worked in fundraising. He currently manages client support services at Sacred Heart Mission, which is a whole sort of he just was describing this to me today, and it's an incredible gamut of services for people who access the mission's various facilities. He's also a freelance journo, just to top all that off as well, and you might have read his work in The Australian and The Monthly and The Age, and so please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Natasha. Look, we all know that politicians use exaggerated language to make their points. And when Kevin Rudd, as Prime Minister, described homelessness in Australia as a national obscenity, you can kind of see where he's coming from. Around 250,000 people are likely to experience homelessness across a year, 100,000 on any given night. There'll be people sleeping rough probably just around the corner from where we are this evening, and it doesn't really make sense in a place this wealthy. The causes of poverty and homelessness have been known to us for years, but we've been kind of scared of the implications. As far back as the 1920s, an American sociologist, Nels Anderson, described the causes of homelessness as having roots at the very core of our life, in our industrial system, in education, cultural and vocational, in family relations, the problems of racial and immigrant adjustment, and in the opportunity offered or denied by society. In other words, homelessness is a byproduct of social policy. It is not that the people affected are in some way inadequate. Poverty is almost always the common denominator among people who are homeless. Homelessness is in many ways the ultimate expression of poverty. And we live in a society which dreads poverty. It's a fear with its very own word, panelliphobia. Being poor and anonymous is widely considered to be a curse. Just look at television's fixation on success stories and personal transformation through cooking shows, talent quests, home improvement programs, not to mention modelling, dance and sports competitions. And if the disadvantaged or poor people feature at all on television, it's usually on commercial current affairs where they are habitually depicted as welfare cheats, bludgers, junkies. Mark Peel is a Melbourne historian who wrote a very fine book about poverty called The Lowest Rung. And Peel describes how such views are generated by a middle Australia that is often antagonistic towards poor people. It's as if their disadvantage might be contagious. Peel summarises the mindset like this: there must be something wrong with poor people. They don't deserve any sympathy, let alone compassion. Now, it kind of sounds familiar to me, this one, because for over a decade, whenever I wrote on homelessness in newspapers, I would always receive chastising mail pointing out that we should not try to help people who won't help themselves. The most common response, and I'll paraphrase this by leaving out the swear words, is this country is filled with opportunities. If you're homeless, it's your fault. Now, look, at this point I'd like to make it clear that there are also many people who are very supportive, as Gerry was saying, who are seriously concerned about social justice, and they are the people who volunteer their time and give generously to causes. But there is an extensive number of people in our community that enjoys looking down on others. In the wider community, a statement I hear a lot is that people choose to be homeless. Well, they rarely do. You end up homeless when you run out of other options. But when you unpack the statement, it's easy to find the stark premise that underpins this belief. And it is a commonly held view that poor people are abnormal, that they make crazy choices. In other words, people choose to sleep on the streets because they're not like us. And if a group of people isn't like us, then we don't have to care about them. This is a game that we've played forever. We've played it with religious groups, Aborigines, gay people, drug users. Years ago, I was offered a large sum of money by a would-be philanthropist who said, and I'm not kidding, give it to someone legit, don't waste it on those you can't help, like a prostitute. This is another dimension to the prejudice about homelessness and disadvantage in general, the idea that some people, that well-worn phrase, qualify as the deserving poor. These are the people who we label worthy of help as long as they are just innocent victims of bad luck. A minister in the Keating government once told me that the average voter wasn't interested in homelessness, and he said if they were, the problem could be fixed pretty quickly. Now, I think, that's an exaggeration, but there's a good hunk of truth to it. The point is, the society we have is made by politicians who create policy in response to our likes and to our bigotries. If the voters care, then so do the politicians. And although the facts on poverty in Australia are readily available, as a nation we don't really understand poverty. Instead, we cling to words like lucky country or the most livable city like incantations to ward off evil. Reading reports about poverty in the media or in university research papers only adds so much to our understanding. A few years ago, I took a policy writer to visit a low-cost hotel, the kind of rundown place people who are homeless often end up living in. There's dozens of them all over Melbourne and hundreds around Australia. Now, this woman had been writing about poverty and inequality for years and how people are forced to live in deplorable and unsafe properties, just like the one we went into. But nothing had prepared her for the conditions inside, and soon she was in tears. Now, she was angry and shocked, and it almost looked like the issue was new to her. For me, this illustrates another key point about poverty. It really only exists as a concept unless you have been poor yourself or you have experienced poverty at work firsthand. Now, our society, like our city, is structured to reward certain people and dump on others. Some are happy with that answer and believe that only the strong and lucky should survive. One of the key questions faced by Western democracies right now, and perhaps a debate as important as the one about climate change, is the debate about the role of government. Right now, around the world and here in the city, there are interest groups who think that government should walk away and let the market rule. In this context, dismantling the welfare support system is seen as a healthy and legitimate enterprise. And it doesn't matter if poor people suffer or die along the way, because in this survival of the fittest scenario, they're lazy and no good. I think it's our fear of poverty, a state of life too many of us consider to be a form of deviancy, that gets in the way of positive social change. We still think that ending poverty involves cutting people off welfare benefits and changing the way poor people behave. The public dialogue on poverty uses terms like mutual obligation and dependency. What we don't often hear is how poverty is largely created by a social condition rather than individual choice. In cities like Melbourne, if we're going to resolve homelessness, the problem isn't just one of finding people a roof. Solutions are rarely that obvious. People who are homeless have very complex problems. They may well have histories of abuse and trauma, often beginning when they were very small children. They may have grown up in state care or foster homes. They may have a mental illness, physical disability, intellectual disabilities, or be physically unwell. And then, owing to their traumatic and disruptive histories, they often have very little formal education. You can't just say to someone in a situation like this, get a job. As we've heard today, poverty is very real and the solutions are complex. We live in a culture that embraces slogans and simplified answers. It's hard work trying to make sense of the world. It's far easier to focus on yourself and keep on walking. I keep coming back to the story of one man I knew who slept rough in Melbourne for some years, and Bill used to sleep covered up in a swag during the day on the footpath on the edge of the CBD. And one summer, Bill died of heat stroke and nobody noticed. For an entire day, hundreds of pedestrians walked past Bill. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone meant to do Bill some harm, but for me, Bill's unhappy fate symbolises very well the plight of those who live homeless all around us. Poverty and disadvantage is a fact of life in our city, and many of us choose to walk on by. Thank you.
So let's open the conversation up. I might just start with a question and then I'd like to just come straight to you. I just want to, it's come up in all of your presentations, the experience of homelessness and housing stress. You know, the Anglicare annual housing snapshot pretty much said there is effectively no affordable housing. If you live under the poverty line in Australia, there is effectively no affordable housing in any capital city of Australia right now. And yet, every weekend, we have this real estate porn in our newspapers. So there's this perverse disconnect going on. What is at the heart of that? Penny?
I think Chris could talk to this, but it's part of the great Australian dream, owning your own house. It's actually meant to be an ambition that we all have. That's not a realistic aspiration for many people, particularly those living below the poverty line or even near the poverty line or even on the minimum wage. it's something that we're brought up to think is always what we should be aiming for. The reality is that people are trying to rent, and they're trying to get rental properties against people with more secure forms of income who may not have the same pressures on their life. The reality is that social and community housing are very hard to access and very crowded, and also may not be near services that you need for a variety of reasons. So it is a really difficult question.
Chris, what are we going to do about this? How do we get Australians panicking about this issue? There is no affordable housing in Australia's capital cities for people under the poverty line.
Absolutely. Look, if I had the answer to that, that'd be fantastic. I'm good at posing problems. Solutions are actually harder. We need a community discussion around this.
Any ideas about where we might start?
Well, I mean, various groups like the Australians for Affordable Housing would argue that we need to reduce taxation. We need to actually get rid of the tax that Gerry and I were talking about before. The name has just completely slipped my mind.
Negative gearing.
Negative gearing. And,
which means if you own a property, you can tax deduct that property.
We know that 1 in 7 Australians own an investment property.
1 in 7.
So there's going to be a fair bit of opposition to that. I mean, it is considered to be an Australian way of life, is buying property. And as you say, it's people who earn moderate incomes, most people now. I was just looking at some stats here. The rate of home purchase among 25 to 44-year-olds has declined 15% in the last 20 years. And house prices have gone, they're now 5 times the average income.
Gerry Naughtin, on this question of well, you know, some people call it wealthy fare, tax breaks for homeowners. Is this a conversation we need to have, and a robust one that we need to have in Australia about the housing shortage, in relation to the housing shortage?
I think it is, Natasha. I think the Henry Review of Taxation highlighted this, and highlighted the fact that in Australia, government is providing tax breaks to the tune of $6 billion in Australia, while we fail to adjust Commonwealth rental assistance on an annual basis. So the reality is we don't index Commonwealth rental assistance on a regular basis. So I think if we look at housing policy, and particularly social housing policy in Australia, we're really failing in this area, and it's an area where we know this is housing costs in the private rental market are eating up a significant amount of the limited money that's available.
Are politicians too scared to take this one on, the whole negative gearing issue?
I think they are. As Chris is saying, I think many middle-income Australians, particularly middle-aged and above Australians, have rental property, and politically it's a very difficult issue.
Sheree, Daly, you're living in your car at the moment. What would make I mean, you spoke about the issues of living in rooming houses, where you want to be living in a safe environment where you're not exposed to drugs and complicated behaviour. What would make the fundamental difference to you, do you think, in terms of having a home?
Well, I actually get New Start, and I've applied for private rental, but it costs an arm and a leg, like $185 to $195 per week, and we don't really get that much on the dole. And then you've got to pay for your electricity, gas, your food even, and I just want a safe environment with a backyard where I can have my dogs and be able to have afforded housing, because most of those rooming houses or accommodation is, I don't know if people have heard, like the Gatwick. I wouldn't let anyone live there, but because of the circumstances...
Just tell us what that is.
Gatwick is an accommodation for people that can't afford, but it's really run down and it's really unfit. So like a lot of these rooming houses that are out there, it's unfit for people to live in, but they don't have any other choice. And if that's what they want for a roof over their head, then that's the consequences they have to live, you know, where carpet's disgusting, there's bed bugs, there's drug dealings, there's suicide, there's police every night, there's some sort of stabbing, people running through it. People don't really care because they're getting the money because they're paying, how much are they paying per week? Nearly 200 or so per week?
Many places like that, and yes, people are paying sometimes 80% of their income.
For a rooming house?
For one room with no bathroom, with a shared kitchen if you're lucky, and maybe a couple of bathrooms between 80 or 90 people.
And are those rooming houses, how are they regulated in a state like Victoria?
Idea, but they are regulated, but a number of them are also illegal ones. So there are people that invest, they get a property and then they rent out all the rooms, and it's under the radar of the authorities.
And they're all doing it for money.
And the irony is, if you close them down, then you lose rooms for people as well.
Yes, so it's a bit of a
Catch-22.
Catch-22, isn't it? And I guess on the question of pets, you know, often people go, well, you should probably get rid of your pets so you can find accommodation. But my observation has been that people who have pets thrive and survive because of that relationship with an animal companion.
Yep, that's correct, because even people in private rental have, working day people and elderly people, they all have pets. And without their pets, some of those people are lonely. And if it wasn't for their pets, it's the pets that keep them going. There's a lot of elderly people that have nothing, and most of the time they die because no one checks up on them. And there's a lot of cases even in government housing where that does happen.
So can I ask a personal question? Where are you managing to get food? And where are you mentioned the food vans. That's one meal, that's at night.
Yep.
And what about showers?
You can either go to, if you go to your friend's house, you can probably have a shower, which my friends are pretty giving, come and have a shower, or you can go to a centre like Sacred Heart Missions, the Salvos when they're open, where you can get breakfast and lunch. There's plenty of places where you can get showers. Sometimes the weekends are hard unless you go to Sacred Heart Mission, but a lot of people don't like to travel to Sacred Heart Mission. It's not because of the workers, it's because of the politics, and there might have been something that happened the night before and these people are going there. So maybe travel aid, being homeless, you can go get a shower during the weekend. Food is places like the food van, St Vincent de Paul's, the Salvation Army come out 5 nights a week. And there's places like church, like a Catholic place like Glen Huntly, or other certain places. Moonee Ponds is another church organisation where they actually do a dinner. Dinner can go all the way to Croydon, but some people, or Geelong, which I know some people travel just to go and get a meal, just to, because they haven't got accommodation or they can't even cook or those sort of situations. But I keep it local, like in Zone 1, and where I can park my car somewhere and hop on the train just to get and walk.
And actually having a car means you're safe in a way, because you can lock those doors.
Yeah, because I can lock those doors and have my dogs there. They're pretty good. They'll let you know if anyone's around. And I don't want to sleep under a bridge because I know, or in a street, because I know what goes on the streets, because I've seen it firsthand, where people could be asleep and people actually, randoms, like drunken, they've been to the pub and actually go and kick someone that's asleep in their sleeping bag because they just don't care. They don't, and they throw abuse at them because of who they are, or, they don't understand why that person's actually there.
Yeah, so keeping safe in your car. Thank you, Sheree. And it is a personal question, asking where you get a wash and where you have food, so thanks for answering them. Let's come to you for questions and comments. You might like to identify yourself or not, but if you could keep it fairly focused so we can move around the room. Thank you. Thanks.
My name's Howard Morossi. I'm a trade union delegate and also an activist with the public housing group. I suppose the question for people on the panel and generally on the housing issue is whether they're aware of the current state of public housing. Public housing is obviously one of the main ways of remedying the situation of homelessness. Public housing tenants only pay 25% of their income in rental, and you're comparing that to, Chris was talking about 80% in other situations. And also, I'd also ask people to look at other solutions beyond just abolishing negative gearing in relation to the private housing market. I think there are much more effective solutions or additional solutions around the world which are being ignored. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I can answer the question about the public housing. It takes ages to actually get on the list. You've got to get all these support letters, you've got to be homeless for a number of time. And when you do get on the housing list, it can take to 3 to 5 years, or even longer, 8 years, which some people are still experiencing. There's a gentleman up in the yellow, he's been waiting a long time for housing. So even if it depends on the areas you're in, it still all takes time. Even though we may have all these vacant housing, government housing, but it's up to the government when they let people move in, and it depends because you're on segment 1, 2 and 3, and everything, as I said, just takes time.
Any comments on the public housing issue in a state like Victoria, but more broadly, and what the future of public housing could be?
Look, from the years 1997 to 2007, 30,000 public housing properties disappeared from the system. They were sold off, essentially. So
this is in Melbourne?
Nationally.
Nationally.
Now, I think public housing is a real answer, absolutely. 25% of your income, a reasonable property with your own facilities, a kitchen and a bathroom, that is the answer, no question, along with community housing and low-cost private rental as well, if that were possible. We've got to remember too that public housing was originally designed for working people and was originally built to house people working at various car companies and manufacturing. All those manufacturing industries have died off. Then we had deinstitutionalisation, and lots of people who ended up in public housing would have formerly been in institutions. So the culture of public housing has changed. And we really need to look at some
public housing setups have become ghettos in their own right, though. So that's always a risk too, isn't there, as Sheree was alluding to. So there's got to be kind of models of public housing that are more sustainable and healthy for residents.
Yes, it's got to be decent, not dodgy, even in the public housing system. And VCOS actually hosts Australians for Affordable Housing campaign here in Victoria. So there's a mix of options. We hear from all our members about public housing pressure all over Victoria. There are massive waiting lists, as Sheree noted. And there's different issues. Some people need to be in public housing for a particular event or time in their life. Other people will always need to be in public housing, and it's actually not viable to look at moving them on. They need to actually be supported to live in a decent place. And there's lots of initiatives to look at ways to create better living environments in some of those ghettos that you talked about. But it's a real issue. You need to be safe and secure in your home, whether it's private accommodation, whether it's in one of those so-called private hotels that you described, or whether it's in public housing. But certainly an issue that we're very active on.
Chris mentioned, Gerry Naughtin, Chris mentioned deinstitutionalisation, and I guess as someone who's so focused on the mental health needs of the community, that's a big issue too, isn't it? That people have been rendered homeless as a result of their mental illness, or in substandard accommodation, without the right sort of support.
It is a big issue, Natasha. I still think sort of the St Kilda, Paran area in particular has been a major sort of source of housing for that group and some of the problems we have in those areas. I think this discussion and the comments are highlighting housing is one of a number of factors that we need to deal with in poverty. And from our experience, for example, at Mind, the mental health issues, issues of trauma are one of the other complicating factors in understanding poverty.
Thank you, Gerry. Let's come to a question. Go for it. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to bring up the notion of the deserving poor, which has been around for a couple of hundreds of years. I think it goes right to the very heart of what borders on apathy towards homelessness and poverty, people in homelessness and poverty situations. I think a lot of Australians, they do have a real disconnect between what is actually happening and their situations. And I think the deserving poor really plays into that, and even our politicians play into that as well.
Do you have a question?
I just wanted to know what the panel thinks about that and how you can actually address that notion.
Panel, esteemed panel.
Oh, I think it starts with conversations like this. It starts with talking about what is poverty, what does it look like, what does it look like when it's extreme, what does it look like when you're on the margins of poverty, what about the people who work but still find it really, really difficult to pay the rent and buy food at the same time. So it actually starts by opening up the concept and addressing the stigma.
I mean, this idea of stigma around poverty, around being poor, around going to Centrelink and negotiating some funding, or fronting up at school as a kid if you haven't had breakfast and you can't go on the school excursion because mum and dad don't have the money. I mean, why the stigma? Yes, maybe it's the fear that Chris was referring to, that we're all just scared that we're just that one step away from it ourselves. But is there something else going on there too? Any thoughts?
I think it might be connected to the Great Australian Dream myth that if you work hard, things will turn out well for you, because we know that that's not always the case. And what we're hearing is that these people accessing emergency relief for the first time, often it's nearly too late by the time they've asked for help, because they're so worried that someone will know that they're in this situation. They're so reluctant to get help that they actually don't access what is available in their neighbourhoods to provide assistance. And it's a very shameful thing. So it's this kind of concept of the Australian way of life, which really there is no Australian way of life. It's a lot of different ways of life.
My theory is there's not enough education, and with all these things coming out saying this is how you should be, when in reality they're not looking behind and seeing what the world here and like all over the world of, well, this is what really happening. They're living like 15, 20 years down the track when they're not dealing with a solution here and now, and there's no education about it because everything's about pokies, or, you know what I mean, they keep bringing out more pokies. Why don't we just try and lessen more pokies so, you know, people don't get tempted just to go to the pokies, or, you know, even alcohol ads and stuff. It's just got way out of control than what it used to be.
Yes. Let's have some more questions. Thank you. Where are we now? Wave that hand.
There, up there.
Go for it. Thank you.
That's me. That's you, mate. I somehow think we're looking in the wrong direction. I think we should be looking at studying wealth. I think we should be looking at studying how wealth is maintained, controlled, how middle-class people are co-opted into idolising wealth, applauding wealth. I think of a time I was driving to work a couple of years ago or a few years ago now, under the John Howard's reign, and it was realised that there was going to be an extra couple of $2 billion of surplus. And the general tenor of the news was that corporate Australia was desperately trying to work out how that they would gain that couple of $2 billion for themselves. These problems go way back. Long before Jesus overturned the money changers' tables, if I may go back another 600 years, the prophet said, you build house upon house, and soon there'll be nowhere else for anyone else to live in the land. It said, you corrupt unjust laws to keep your privilege. We have the shock jocks. We have all sorts of people trying to keep the poor in place. We shouldn't be studying poverty, we should be studying wealth.
Gerry, Naughtin.
I think that's a really important perspective, and much of the writing and thinking in relation to poverty is reinforcing your point. One of the key arguments that's come out of an Indian economist called Sen has been this point: how do we build people's capacity? And a whole range of ideas from microfinance through, in Australia, I think the strong thrust of government and welfare agencies involved in this space is how do we support people in terms of access to education and ways in which we can find employment. Because I think, again, education and employment, which is really the route for the middle class in Australia, is clearly the key strategy in supporting people on low incomes to improve their incomes. So I think my comment would be this perspective you're putting, I think, is very much in tenor with, I think, the contemporary thinking. The question is, what's the balance in that? And I think one of the questions I'm raising is, while people are needing that assistance to move out of poverty, is it fair and reasonable to ask them to live on a level of income beyond which we really are saying is not acceptable? And I think that's the key dilemma in this poverty development debate that is so important.
I'm just going to... We can't hear you without a microphone, but I need to go to another question. I really must. I'm sorry. But hold that thought. I think we heard Gina Reinhardt in there.
Yes, we did.
And I don't think Gina's got a poverty problem. Something
Hi,
tells
Gerry,
me.
you spoke about some of the failures of job support programs, and Sheree, you talked about hoping and planning to work in the future, and I was hoping you could tell us or describe for us what your perfect job would be.
Can you hold that thought? Thank you. Can you hold that question in mind, and I'll just come to another one while we're here. Next one.
Natasha, thank you. Over here. I really appreciated Life Matters on Friday and how you really sound like you're championing single parents, because a lot of people seem to give us the feeling we don't matter and our children don't matter. But I really appreciate you're someone in the media that is making women and children and fathers and children matter. So just wanted to say, don't get too carried away with public housing. When you look at all the structures of these changes for single parents, income goes up, rent goes up for people in public housing. The other thing that's interesting about the things that are being taken away from single parents is that the education supplements don't happen with New Start. So people like me in the golden days who did my university while I was bringing up my children, thinking I'd get a job now, and all I could get was casual, insecure stuff. But no longer will parents be even seen as people who have a right to start educating themselves for a job when their children reach the age of 8. Instead, they're chucked out into the hopeless menial workforce if they can get anything at all. So let's keep remembering the structure, because the ideology is just no good at all.
Thank you for that. Hold that thought if you'd like to make a comment on that. I'd like to come one more if I can. Where's the next one? Here? Thank you.
Yeah, like many in the audience, I remember Prime Minister Bob Hawke saying that no child will be living in poverty, ... Now, I enjoyed Chris's talk because I think there's political solutions that really need to be looked at, and probably I'd like to ask each of the panel what one political decision they would support now that would make a difference. And if I can throw my suggestion into the social housing area, I would like my superannuation to go into social housing and not to go into the stock market. And I'm sure a lot of people here would want that, and the cost, the direction would be significant.
Thank you. So, response on some... Gerry, there was a question directed to you particularly on work.
I think the question was perhaps what are more effective job placement, work finding solutions. Our experience at mine, certainly with people with mental health issues, is we have a job placement system that focuses on placing people and providing subsidies within 13 or 26 weeks. Our experience is that many people with mental health issues need ongoing support in the workplace, both for them and others in managing their employment in the workplace. So I think that's one aspect. The other one, I think, is the level of subsidy provided by government for training and skill development is not sufficient. The ACOS report, I think we're saying it's between $550 and $1,100 per participant, and the need again to think about what's our investment in skilling people up to provide them with the skills to continue in work is clearly another feature, I think, of our current system.
Penny Wilson, we heard from a single mum with some of her comments about the New Start situation. I was interested to read in the opener of ACOS's rather robust report that was released this week that Dr John Folson of the St Vincent's de Paul said, "It's a matter of deep shame for a wealthy nation like ours that our unemployment benefits, for example, have been kept deliberately low as a means of humiliating the very people they were originally designed to assist." Now, the government would argue that this is not about humiliation, keeping New Start low, that this is about building an incentive for people to get off and escape the cycle of welfare so that they can get into the workforce.
Yes, I have heard that argument. It's actually, the figure in the report is that 25% of the households below the poverty line are sole parent households. So I would say that many single parent households are represented in those working poor statistics as well, in the 29% of people who are actually having a wage come into the home but still live below the poverty line, which is quite a scary concept, to be out there and working really hard but not even able to make the minimum wage. And don't forget that this is a lot lower than the minimum wage. The concept that you have to be kept poor because otherwise you might not want to go out and work, I don't think stacks up in the research. I actually worked at the Department of Social Security 20 years ago when I finished my studies, and it's quite frightening to see that the level, which I was just checking up on that, it's $35 a day, $254 a week. It's really similar to what they paid when they started New Start 20 years ago. I find that astronomically frightening. And I used to have to visit the Gatwick as part of my rounds back then. It's terrifying, and I can't believe it's still standing. But it's a really complex question, because I get asked about the poverty trap. One of your colleagues today, John Fain, asked me about the poverty trap, or working poor below the poverty line. And people are afraid that if they make it too attractive to stay on welfare, that people might not go out and get a job. But the research, and I think Gerry will back me up here, shows that that's just not the case. The reasons that people are unemployed are very complex. Very few people choose to be unemployed for long periods of time. The economic restructuring of the economy, geographical factors, the availability of public transport, the costs of childcare, the difficulty of finding family flexible workplaces that work with the school hours, everything stacks up against some people getting meaningful work. Their inability to access vocational education and training, their inability to actually learn in the same way that everyone else learns, these are all factors. So it's a very complex question, and there is a punishment mentality that I think we need to discuss and break through.
But there is an extent that people can get stuck, because if they earn a modicum of income, they lose their benefits. And so sometimes people do what is a very straightforward calculation and go, well, this is not possible. It's better I stay on my benefits than compromise that small amount of money that I know I can get.
That's right. Accommodation and childcare costs often come into that equation as well. It's really difficult to work if you can't access childcare, and even community-based childcare is very expensive, and it needs to be, because you need appropriate care for your children in care, but it's a very complex question, and I don't think we can solve it now, but I hope that there is the increase that our colleagues at ACOS are campaigning for.
Chris Middendorp, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say, how do you think it's going to play with the electorate if a government says we're going to put up unemployment benefits by $50? I wonder if there are any votes in that decision, and whether that's one of the reasons why it hasn't happened.
Well, speaking of votes, Gerry, did you want to say something?
Again, I think one of my earlier comments about the number of people who are concerned for a range of reasons, but we do have the Business Council of Australia coming out recently concerned about poverty, and they're recognising again the broader sort of social and economic impact of poverty. So we do, within the community across the political spectrum, have, I think, many people concerned about this issue.
I want to come to some more questions if I can, but I haven't forgotten your one political decision question, so just keep fermenting on that one if you can, and we'll have a few more questions and comments. Thank you. Down the front.
If you look at Greece, these countries that are, this is the way we're going. Now, unless we really get scared and do something about it, and educate people, and that's a generic cause, I believe. I'd like your comment on that.
Okay, hold that thought if you can. And we'll have another comment in the middle there. Thank you.
My name is Maria. I lost my job at the end of March this year. I'm tertiary qualified. I do CAD, I do architectural drafting. I have tried to get a job in my industry. I've applied for hundreds of jobs. I'm on a New Start allowance, which no one can be expected to live upon. Now, the Australian government have just spent $40 million trying to get a seat on the Australian Securities, or on the Securities Council at the United Nations, and I'd like to read you just a couple of small articles from the United Nations.
I can't have a whole article read, but if there's Go for it. Thanks, Maria.
Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or the other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment.
Thank you. All right. I'd like to just come to a couple more if I can. Do you mind? Can you retain all this?
That's all right.
I'm keeping a few notes for you.
Hopefully.
Because there's some interesting comments and experiences being shared here, and I think it's worthwhile.
Gives us time to think about the one thing.
And we've got a couple of minutes to go, so I'm just trying to pack a few more perspectives in.
My name's Jo. I'm one of those New Start Allowance candidates. I've been fortunate enough to become a resident at Home Ground, which is on Elizabeth Street, and I managed to get in there by claiming that I was earning an income, and you have to earn a minimum of $450 a week to obtain a unit in that building. I'm blessed. I'm so thankful for low-income housing. But I'm now on New Start Allowance, so my income is around, New Start Allowance, $300 a week with rental assistance. One thing I never ever hear about is quite a few years ago, the government brought in this policy that if you're 31, once you turn 31, that you have to take private health insurance. And if you don't, then each year you don't have private health insurance, you get a penalty of 2% on your premium. So when you reach the age of 60, and you've never paid for private health insurance, you've got 30 years times 2%, which makes 60% penalty rate on your premium payments. Now, prior to me getting into my current situation, I started paying for my private health insurance. Once you stop, you have to start the whole thing all over again. So you could be paying for private health insurance. For me, it came in at about 2 years before I turned 31. So for quite a few years, paying for my private health insurance. Now I'm in a situation where I've continued to pay that, but I don't eat. And I've just become 2 weeks in arrears with my rent.
Okay.
I don't know who to speak to about this, but I never ever hear this issue being raised.
All right, thank you.
And I think it's blackmailed by the government. I think it's absolutely appalling. And no one's spoken up about it.
Thank you very much. Private health insurance is a choice that you make. You're not obliged to make the choice, but yes, there is a policy that influences that choice. Can we have one more comment, if we can? Thank you.
My name is Brian Ormsby. I'm president of the Oakley Lions Club, and for the past, since I retired, past 12 or 13 years, I've co-managed a fairly successful opportunity shop. And hearing ACOS Penny's report tonight makes me wonder whether we're all wasting our time. It's just so much worse than it was 10 years, 12 years ago when I got into this game. And it got me thinking about how we go about, how are we going to beat this problem, which is just huge. And first one, I thought it's got to be a combined effort. All around Australia, there's Rotarians, Lions, Kiwanis and various other groups, and we're all doing our little bit and with good heart and goodwill, but it's scattered. It's not a concerted thing. If somehow all these service groups were brought together and given a more defined plan of action, I think we'd do a lot better. Something Chris said tonight, I'm not quite sure the words he used, but he alluded to, you know, we're all living in fear these days. I call it a shroud of bewilderment. The world's going so quick we can't keep up with it, and it's very hard for us to get together to really do things. And then on top of that, until both our Commonwealth and state governments get real leaders, people who can see beyond the next election, I think we might be 10 years' time, we'll be looking at figures that are equal to that now. Okay. Thank you.
We have a very emphatic hand, and Jeff's one more. Okay, he's the boss, so he gets to say, and then we'll go for a round-up comment from you all.
My question is, I'm living on the streets and I'm at a vacant office block. It's been sitting in limbo for a good 20 years and they're just waiting for the price to go up. What are they going to do with all the vacant buildings?
You're talking about a vacant office block?
Yes, I'm living out there at the moment in North Melbourne.
Thank you. Yes, vacant houses. Doesn't that drive you batty when we're talking about this issue? Vacant houses. Right, so we had quite a lot of topics there. There was the one political decision that you'd like to be made now. Let's start with that. What one political decision would you like to be made now to directly target this conversation?
For me, the answer would be, it's hard to make a choice, but the one choice would be annual indexation of the Commonwealth rental allowance, which is specifically targeted at people at low income in the private rental market.
I'm very torn between short-term immediate solutions and longer-term. You mentioned the superannuation and the choice to invest in social housing. Mine was something around that. Mine is tax incentive for social investment, for social capital, if you like. Chris Middendorp.
Someone here mentioned Spain and Greece and the economies going belly up. I think part of the reason for that is they simply weren't collecting tax. It was a big issue there, and a lot of private and public debt. So my thing would be tax reform. We've got to pay for this stuff, and until we are a responsible culture, everyone pays their fair share of tax. That's where our hospitals and our housing systems and our mental health services come from. So I'd like to see the government find a way to engage meaningfully in a debate with the community around real tax reform.
Sheree Daly.
Oh, well, there's plenty I could choose from, but mine would be not so long waiting list on government housing and cheaper real estate rentals so people can afford to live and buy what they need.
Okay, and we also had, we also had the question about super and whether we should be thinking about how we invest our super funds differently in Australia, social housing being one opportunity. We also had the possibility of the wider community sector engaging with these issues, service groups prioritising poverty, like the Lions Clubs and Rotary and the like. And I guess the question also about vacant properties not being made available to people who need them. Go for it. And also age discrimination was a big one too. And looking at that ACOS data, it was very interesting to see that people who are young are doing it high in the figures of poverty. People who are over 60 are doing it badly in terms of poverty as well.
Yes, all the vulnerable groups were well represented in the below the poverty line stats. I think it was Brian from the Oakley Lions about the services working better together. That's actually a main priority for VCOS. We're doing a lot of work around that at the moment. Anyone who's read any of the reports in Victoria looking into, for instance, protecting Victoria's vulnerable children will note that the Cummins report and other reports found that gaps between services and even governments not talking to each other and within themselves were a main reason that these crimes against children went undiscovered, that we're not protecting our children sufficiently. And we know that there's a link between what happens in your childhood and terrible outcomes later on and falling into the poverty cycle or staying there. So services working together more effectively is certainly a very high priority for us. And I think age discrimination is alive and well, very unfortunately, and that needs to be discussed and acknowledged as well.
Any final comments from our other panellists?
Can I say something? I'll refer to the lady that was talking about how hard it is to go and get work. Well, you know, I'm not racist. I agree about helping other people in other countries, but that's what's making our country even bigger than it is we're bringing in a lot of people from other countries. They're off getting jobs, houses and everything else. And I remember the government specifically saying is we help our backyard before we're helping everyone else. We're helping everyone else and we're not helping everyone. So when people like that lady up at the back it's got all this experience, all the jobs go to other cultures, and it makes it difficult for Australian people to go and get jobs because people from different backgrounds are willing to work for much less money than what they're entitled to.
Although it could be argued that people in all cultures experience age discrimination in Australia. I think it's probably universal.
Yeah.
Chris or Gerry, final comments
Just
from you.
A final comment. I think these questions and the discussion is really highlighting, I think, an important issue for Anti-Poverty Week, that in a sense these issues are multi-causal and we need multiple solutions. If there was a simple answer to poverty, we would have found it. And I think we need to highlight the whole question. It's income, it's housing, it's access to health services, it's transport. There's a range of factors that we need to understand are contributors to poverty, and we need action on multiple fronts.
Which means we've got to talk to each other.
Indeed it does.
The great challenge that is. Chris?
Everything he said, plus we need an ongoing debate about it, yeah.
Well, it starts with us, doesn't it? So thank you very much for being here tonight. I greatly appreciate it. I'd also like to acknowledge the City of Melbourne's Melbourne Conversations team, the Sacred Heart Mission, the Big Issue and future leaders. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge Penny Wilson, Sheree Daly, Dr. Gerry Naughtin, Chris Middendorp, and all of the events that are happening throughout Anti-Poverty Week. Thank you. Thank you.